Hello there. Welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. Before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I will be coloring the Stamping Bella Gnome stamp with Copic markers. I have a collection here on my desk. I will be stamping and coloring him on Neenah Solar White Classic Crest 80-pound cardstock, and I will be placing him on this piece of paper that I watercolored a while ago. I was practicing my wet on wet watercolor technique, and I loved that, so I kept it, and that will be our background for the day. I will be inking up this image in Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink because it is an alcohol marker safe ink. I am going to stamp this image only one time because it is a rubber mounted stamp. So normally speaking, you don't need to double stamp it. It stamps very well. This image also is a very fine lined image, and I don't want to risk budging it or smudging it because obviously it's not a clear stamp. I can't see if I'm lined up properly. So I just have to make sure I get it right the first time. You will notice in my coloring that sometimes I show you a set of colors and then I pull another color into that. It is because I'm looking for darker shadows. Also, at the end of the card, there is some die cutting involved, and I'm also going to be using my brother's Scan and Cut to cut out this stamped image in order to place it on the front of this pre-made card front. Now that we have covered all of the coloring bases, let's talk about our crime. Our alphabetical journey today takes us to the state of Oregon. Oregon is part of the Pacific Northwest with the Columbia River delineating much of the northern boundary between Washington State, the Snake River delineating much of the eastern boundary with the state of Idaho, and the 42nd North Parallel delineating the southern boundary with California and Nevada, and the Pacific Ocean making up the western boundary. Slavery played a major part in Oregon's history and even influenced its path to statehood. But before that became the thing, before statehood was the thing, right? The Lewis and Clark expedition traversed Oregon in the early 1800s. The first permanent European settlements in Oregon were established by fur trappers and traders. In 1843, an autonomous government was formed in Oregon Country, and the Oregon Territory was created in 1848. The territory's request for statehood was delayed several times as members of Congress argued among themselves whether the territory should be admitted as a free or slave state. Eventually, politicians from the South agreed to allow Oregon to enter as a free state in exchange for the option of having slavery in the southwest part of the United States. Oregon was admitted to the Union on February 14, 1859, although no one in Oregon knew it until March 15th of the same year. The state of Oregon has a unique two-sided flag. Bet you didn't know that. And Oregon is home to more strip clubs per capita than anywhere else in the nation. Now, I have lived in both Oregon and Nevada, and I was surprised that Oregon had that title. Weird. Okay. Oregon is home to Crater Lake, the deepest lake in the world, and Mills End Park, the smallest park in the world. It measures only 2 feet across. It's literally like the center of a turnabout. Oregon was the first state to ban non-recyclable plastics and cans. And Eugene was the first city to have one-way streets. And yes, the first time I drove in downtown Eugene in the dark, I went the wrong way down a one-way street. Anyways, Eugene is also on the top 10 list of best cities for bicycling. Oregon is home to 1/4 of all the country's llamas and is home to the most ghost towns in the nation. The Tillamook Cheese Factory is the largest cheese factory in the world and is also located in Oregon. The shortest river and largest gorge both claim Oregon as home. Nike originated in Oregon with the swoosh design being created by a Portland State University student. She was paid $35 for her contribution to Nike's brand. In Oregon, you may not box with a kangaroo in Myrtle Creek or share a drink with more than one other person in Stanfield. And you may not pump your gas statewide. Oregon is home to many strange and wonderful things and places, and today we will talk about one of the firsts, the first murder in Mount Hood, or on Mount Hood, because it's technically a mountain. Perry Vickers was born in 1845 in Ohio, no month or date listed, to Jesse and Eliza Vickers. It seems that he was third of their four children, Emmeline, Edmund, Perry, and Orland. So the middle of three boys with an older sister. Yay, her. There is not a lot of information about their early life. By the 1950 census, he was recorded as living in Indiana with his parents. Obviously, he would have been like 5. But his parents, both their death is recorded as Indiana in 1855 for his father and 1856 for his mother. That would have made Perry 11 by the time he was orphaned. So the next record I could find of Perry Vickers was when he arrived in Vancouver, Washington in about 1865. And the next thing you know, the next thing I found is that he pops up in Oregon. Now, Perry Vickers was described as a dreamer and a poet, but he did not start out his residence in Oregon on quite legally solid footing. As he was traveling through the state of Oregon looking for work, he fell into the company of some other young strangers in apparently the same situation, wandering around looking for work. However, it turns out that their situation was a little bit different than his. You see, while traveling looking with these new friends, traveling looking for work, they were arrested by military officers from Fort Vancouver and charged with horse theft. Remember, horse theft is a hangable offense in those days? Yeah. So he was taken to Fort Vancouver and they were held for about 2 months in a jail cell that was made of wood and awaited trial. Now, because the jail was less than secure, the men were each wearing what was referred to as an Oregon boot. This device was a 7-pound iron ring that was worn on an ankle to impede the progress of an escape. Kind of like the way they supposed a ball and chain would work. Now, Perry pled guilty by association, but he adamantly denied having stolen any horses. But fearing that the pending trial and an unsympathetic court would leave him jailed, he and the men who probably did steal horses decided to escape. As I said before, this jail was made out of wood, and the wooden window bars were 2x4s. So during the night, the men removed enough 2x4 window bars to escape. Now, once Perry was away from the jail, he separated himself from his quote-unquote friends. And once he heard that their escape had been discovered, he took off away from them as fast as he could go, still wearing this Oregon boot. Now, running with 7 pounds on one ankle would not be, I would not be able to do it, but I'm not young and healthy. I'm old and chubby. So still weighed down by this Oregon boot, he stumbled away from Fort Vancouver and headed toward the Columbia River. His ankle was becoming chafed and very painful, and he tried to find a way to pry it loose, but he could hear the people chasing him. So as the sounds of the pursuit became louder, he continued to run, and he found himself about to be surrounded on the bank of the Columbia River. He had 2 choices, and it is not known for sure how or where Perry learned to swim, but he did. He jumped into the Columbia River. This is a mile-wide, very fast-moving river, and swam across it. And he made it to the whole other side, still wearing that Oregon boot on his ankle. Okay, that's pretty amazing. I have driven down that gorge, I've driven past the Columbia River, it does not move slow. So it is impressive that he swam across it. And then you add that extra 7 pounds around one leg. That's pretty cool. Okay. He's pretty cool dude in my book right now. Once across the river, Perry came across a small farm where he was able to find some tools to remove the iron device. He found an old wagon wheel wrench, and he used that as a hammer, and he found a bolt to use as a punch to remove the pin that held the device together. So it's kind of like a clamp that went around the leg. And the next morning, he came across some woodcutters who gave him some food and told him how to get to Powell Valley, where one of his brothers lived. So once he made it there, his brother gave him a minute to rest, gave him some clothes and some supplies, and advised him to head to Eastern Oregon. He told him to use Barlow Road and look for work on the eastern side of the state until things cooled down for him, until people were not actively looking for him anymore. So as Perry did what his brother suggested and headed east, he came across a man named Stephen Coleman. This Stephen was the one in charge of maintaining Old Barlow Road, and he told Perry that he would be hiring to help clear the road after the winter storm damage. And so in June, Perry went to work for Stephen, and they developed a lifelong friendship. Stephen and his son Elijah, known as Lige, were actually legendary on Mount Hood for their adventures, and that's a whole other story for a different kind of video. But Stephen had said that through the time, Perry proved that he was not a horse thief. Like, his character was not one of dishonesty or thievery. And Stephen was convinced that Perry was a victim of circumstances. So that June, the cleanup crew set up camp at a place called Summit Meadow. And Perry spent his non-work time exploring the area from the timberline, from the road, up to the timberline level of Mount Hood. And he was thrilled by his hikes. He swore that one day he would climb to the top of Mount Hood. Perry eventually took the job of gatekeeper on the eastern entrance to the old road, away from the chance of being recognized as a fugitive. Eventually, his friend Stephen persuaded him to return to the western side of Mount Hood and assured him that if there was ever a need arose, that Stephen would help him secure legal services to defend him against the horse stealing charges. So Stephen, also good dude in my book. He seems like he's a pretty nice guy. Now, no charges of horse thievery or anything else were brought against Perry, but in his trips to the west side of the mountain, he fell in love with that area. He especially loved the area around the Summit Meadows, right under the looming view of the south side of Mount Hood. He envisioned that he could run a business there that would help travelers as they passed through the area. So Perry filed for a squatter's claim at Summit Meadow and went to work on the buildings that were there, improving them and making them better in between his work on the old road. By 1866, work on the Summit House was underway. Now, this was a large building. It was 20 feet by 20 feet by 32 feet with a huge fireplace at one end and the sleeping quarters upstairs. And it had a huge arrangements for cooking. Not what you would call a modern kitchen, but, it had a great place to cook meals. Perry built all of the furniture from natural materials in the area. And in the spring of 1868, he opened the Summit House as soon as the snow melted and the road was cleared. He provided food for travelers as well as their livestock. He had spaces for camping, and in many cases insisted in having folks in for a meal. There is even a story told of a day when a group of wagons came to Summit Meadow in 1882. There was a baby boy from one of the parties, the Barclay family, who had gotten ill and died while they were at Summit Meadow. And Perry granted permission for the baby to be buried in the meadow on his property. The little grave and headstone are still there. See, he's a good guy. For many years, Perry resided at Summit Meadows and helped countless travelers that passed by and hundreds of people to the top of the mountain. One day in August of 1893, A man named Steele had been a farmhand near the Columbia Slough. He stole his employer's shotgun and headed east. Now, there's not a lot of details known about Steele, the reason he stole the gun, the reason he took off, left his employment, but the Multnomah County Sheriff was called and 2 men were deputized, one of them being the owner of the stolen gun, a man named Rourke. So whatever Steele did, it was bad enough that his employer was deputized in order to go chase him down. And I'm guessing it's not because he stole the gun, right? That was a byproduct of whatever else happened. Once these men were organized as deputized sheriffs, they mounted up on their horses and went after Steele. So these new deputies reached Eagle Creek and had to have their Multnomah County warrant reissued in Clackamas County. And while they were there, they learned that Steele had traded the shotgun for a Sharps rifle. So they continued to travel and reached the town of Sandy, and the weather actually had started to go bad. They stayed long enough to buy a bottle of whiskey and then headed out on their way. The 2 men then reached the town of Salmon, where they met a local resident named John McIntyre who owned a trading post there. It was then that one of the deputies returned home because he became ill. So John McIntyre was deputized, and he joined the remaining men and proceeded to travel toward Summit Meadow. Guess who the guy who didn't go home sick was? Yeah, Rourke. Once the men reached Summit Meadow and Perry's Summit House, Perry advised them that Steele had stayed there the night before, and he agreed that in his opinion, Steele was an unsavory character, but he also claimed that he had not spoken of a gun theft. Perry told them that he had mentioned that he was going to camp at White River, which was a little further to the north and east from where they were. Because the deputies had been drinking some of that whiskey they purchased, Perry told them they should probably get some sleep, sleep it off, and proceed in the daytime. Perry also thought that they would be at a disadvantage in the dark. Rourke, the gun owner and employer, he insisted that they push on into the night. Because of course he did. He wants his gun back. Except it's not even his gun anymore because that gun was traded. But whatever. Perry told them that they should eat something and then he would go with them to chase after Steele. And I suppose he thought he was keeping them safe from themselves because, drunk people and horses with guns. That's, not usually a good combination. We'll just call it that. Not usually a good combination. After dinner, he did convince them to eat. Perry was deputized by the men, which I find interesting that the deputy was able to deputize another man, but okay, whatever. Perry was deputized by the men. They mounted their horses, and because he was familiar with the area, Perry took the lead. I'm sure that was his insistence. Now, the group of men made it to the White River Trading Post, which was operated by a man named Cornelius Gray and his family. And it was there beyond the buildings that the man spotted a campfire, and they guessed that it was probably Steele. Now, being concerned because of the drunken condition of his companions, and because he was equipped with a set of Colt revolvers, Perry volunteered to approach the fire. He did so at an angle that made the other 2 not quite visible because of the light of the fire. And they stood back in case there was trouble. So Perry rode, there we go, words are hard, toward the campfire. And upon reaching the fire, he confirmed that it was indeed Steele. So Steele was then alerted to the fact that Perry was coming toward him. And it seemed, according to those that were there from a distance, that Steele approached to come talk to Perry, started walking toward him. As Perry went to dismount from his horse and was in kind of a helpless position, meaning his back was probably to Steele, Steele picked up the Sharps rifle and shot Perry in the stomach. Yeah. As he fell from the horse, he wasn't even all the way off his horse. As he fell from the horse, he grabbed one of his revolvers, but did not get a shot off before Steele disappeared into the darkness of the night. Perry then emptied his revolvers into the night, thinking that he hit Steele, but that was never confirmed, never able to be proven. So Cornelius, the trading post operator, heard the gunshots, grabbed his rifle, and came running. Two other men who were at the trading post, as well as the two less than sober deputies, got to Perry, who was on the ground in agonizing pain and mortally wounded. They carried Perry inside Cornelius's home. Perry claimed that he saw his companions come toward him, but not until after they came out of hiding during the gunshots. The men claimed that their horses bolted from being startled by the gunshots. But while he lay there, Perry confronted the men. He said that they were too experienced with guns and horses, and he did not believe for a minute that the horses were startled. He called them cowards. Now, this is all reported by Cornelius. He was the one who reported this interaction between Perry and the deputies. I'm using air quotes on that word because they're not nice people, in my opinion, right now. Anyways, a writer was sent to go fetch Stephen Coleman, Perry's best friend Stephen. Perry knew he did not have much time, and in fact, he died before Stephen could return to the trading post. Many locals from the area helped with his burial. Sam Welch and Stephen Mitchell split the boards for his coffin. Oliver Yoakum, a man who established the town of Government Camp, officiated the ceremony. Perry Vickers was laid to rest in the little graveyard next to the baby Barclay, as were his last wishes, again reported by Cornelius Gray. Their headstones can still be seen on the west side of the meadow. Stephen kept Perry's blood-stained coveralls for years with the hope that they may be used as evidence to convict Steele of Perry's murder. A couple of years after Perry's death, a horse thief was hanged in eastern Oregon, and he claimed that he'd killed a man in the Cascade Mountains. It was assumed then that this was Steele. Not long after that report, Stephen burned Perry's coveralls, closing a chapter of an era on Mount Hood and the case of Mount Hood's first murder. So that was kind of a sadder story than some of our others. I don't know why. Maybe because Perry just seemed to be likable. Like, people liked him. Even horse thieves liked him. People liked Perry. I thought it was an interesting story. But then again, I picked it. So, of course, I thought it was an interesting story. We are almost done with the card assembly here. Hopefully you saw and kind of understood what was going on with my printer, my Brother Scan and Cut. Because this background is watercolor paper, I do want to assemble it with some very strong adhesive. So I'm using Suquain tape or whatever it's called, Terran tape. And I learned this trick watching the Ellen Hudson channel, where you only peel the backing off about halfway and then get it in place and then peel it off the rest of the way, because this is a very strong tape. Now, you may have noticed that the Scan and Cut did not cut the bubbles out of this image very well, so I came up with a plan B. I am going to ink up those bubbles in a white pigment ink and then heat set them on the front of this card. Now, really, I should have done this before I put the card panel onto the card base, but you know, this is the order in which I did the thing, so this is the order in which you see the things. I did pull out my white embossing powder. I forgot to treat the paper with my anti-static powder tool, so it did collect a little bit of extra embossing powder I did need to clean off with just a dry paintbrush. And then I heat set that with my heat tool. I did add a little bit of white gel pen to the bubbles just to give them some extra dimension. And now it is time to adhere our gnome. I am using Tombow Mono liquid glue because, well, I'm crazy, but because I didn't want to use foam tape or tape runner. Again, this is watercolor paper, so there's lots of texture. For my sentiment, I am using these gnome sayings from Simon Says Stamp and this little stamp set that has teeny tiny sentiments in it. I can't remember what it's called. It's Simon Says Stamp. I'm also using these label dies from Simon Says Stamp that coordinate with all of these sentiment strips that they sell, no matter what. I mean, they have tons and tons of them for every season impossible. And they had a gnome release one year, so they came out with gnome sayings. But I want to make this a birthday stamp. So I'm going to, or a birthday card rather. So I'm going to stamp happy birthday. And then I will use that My Best Gnomey label from Simon Says Stamp. Wow, you guys, I am struggling right now. I got done telling the story and now I can't remember how to make a card. Anyways, the card is assembled. We're going to zoom in a little bit so you can see the beard on that gnome. And the funny thing is, when I took a picture, the background totally changed, but it is more aqua than blue because, yeah, aqua. I have pictures. This is Perry. This is Perry Vicks. Isn't he a dapper looking young man? I mean, yeah. And this is an Oregon boot. I had to find a picture. I had to know what they were talking about. The next picture I'm going to show you is his homestead. This is Summit Meadows, right at the base of the mountain, and gorgeous. And there is one picture of the little graveyard that he created after that baby boy died at his home. I hope you enjoyed our story today. If you have a comment, leave it down below. I want to know your thoughts on this story. I have a couple of other videos here I think you would enjoy. I've also added a subscribe button. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button. Give me a thumbs up. Let YouTube know you liked the video. And I hope you have a fabulous day.